Hey friend, tonight we drift back through time to an age often whispered about as dark. But in the stillness of night, we will walk more slowly, letting the shadows soften until what seemed bleak begins to reveal itself as something far more human. Imagine the flicker of candlelight on stone walls, the steady crackle of wood smoke in the hearth, and the quiet echo of footsteps across monastery halls. Outside, the muddy roads of villages wind between fields, while the air carries both the scent of damp earth and the unshakable presence of faith. The Dark Ages were never truly silent nor empty. Between wars and plagues, people lived ordinary lives, plowing fields, weaving cloth, telling stories by firelight, and raising children against the uncertain backdrop of the world. Their nights were filled with fears of spirits and raiders, but also with songs, prayers, and laughter shared around hearths. Monks bent over illuminated manuscripts, their hands steady as they preserved knowledge that might otherwise have slipped away. Towers rose against the moonlight, castles loomed over valleys, and churches reached upward like mountains carved of stone. This is not the tale of kings and conquests alone, but of peasants and pilgrims, women with quiet wisdom, children at play, and communities bound together by necessity. It is a story of superstition and survival, but also of music, color, faith, and the first sparks of renewal. So, as you settle beneath the blanket of night, let us wander together through these shadowed centuries, past flickering lanterns, along silent battlements, and into the hidden corners of the Dark Ages. Here, in the hush of history, the myths will loosen and a gentler truth will emerge. Were they really dark? The phrase itself conjures a powerful and immediate image: the Dark Ages. We see a world plunged into a millennium of gloom between the gleaming, sunlit columns of ancient Rome and the brilliant artistic dawn of the Renaissance. We imagine a landscape of unrelenting violence, of brutish, ignorant people living in squalor, their lives devoid of art, of learning, of hope. We see a void, a great black hole in the history of human progress. But as you settle into the quiet of your own evening, let us gently unravel this myth. For the truth is a far more subtle, more complex, and more human story. The term Dark Ages was not coined by the people who lived through it. They did not think of themselves as living in an age of darkness. They, like us, simply thought of themselves as living in the present. The term was invented much later by the scholars and poets of the Italian Renaissance, men like Petrarch, who looked back with a sense of profound admiration at the glories of classical Greece and Rome. From their perspective, the centuries that followed the fall of the Roman Empire were a dark and barbarous interruption, a long, dreary winter of the human spirit. It was a term of judgment, a way of defining their own age of supposed light and rebirth by contrasting it with a past they saw as stagnant and unenlightened.
And in some ways, their judgment was not entirely without merit. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century was a catastrophic event. The vast, centralized political and economic machine that had held Europe together for centuries was shattered. The great Roman roads fell into disrepair. The aqueducts crumbled. The once thriving cities shrank into small, fortified towns or were abandoned altogether. The complex, continent-spanning trade networks that had brought wine from Gaul and olive oil from Spain to the furthest reaches of Britain fell apart. Life became more localized, more dangerous, and for many, more impoverished. Literacy, once widespread among the Roman elite, declined dramatically. The great libraries of the ancient world were lost to fire, to neglect, to the chaos of invasion. The sophisticated philosophical and scientific knowledge of the Greeks and Romans was largely forgotten in the West, replaced by a worldview that was dominated by faith, by scripture, and by a deep sense of the world's sinfulness and decay. In this sense, a certain kind of light, the light of classical secular reason, was indeed extinguished, or at least greatly dimmed. But to see this as the whole story is to be blinded by the very myth we are trying to dispel. The Dark Ages were not an empty void. They were a period of profound and dynamic transformation. They were not a time of stagnation, but a time of creation, a slow and often painful forging of a new world from the ashes of the old.
While the old Roman world was dying, new peoples, the Franks, the Goths, the Anglo-Saxons, were building new kingdoms, creating new laws, new languages, new forms of social organization. This was the age that gave birth to the modern nations of Europe. It was a time of immense creativity, but it was a creativity that expressed itself in different forms. The genius of the age was not to be found in the building of marble temples, but in the intricate, abstract, and breathtakingly beautiful metalwork of a Saxon jeweler, or in the complex, interwoven knotwork of a Celtic manuscript. It was not an age without learning. It was an age where learning found a new home. The flickering candle of knowledge was not extinguished, it was carried into the stone scriptoriums of the monasteries, where a new kind of scholar, the monk, patiently and painstakingly preserved the wisdom of the past and created the new theological and philosophical frameworks that would shape the Western mind for 1,000 years. The darkness of the Dark Ages is, in many ways, a darkness of our own making. It is the darkness of a historical record that is sparse and often silent. The grand narratives of kings and battles have survived, but the quiet, ordinary lives of the vast majority of people have been lost to us. They lived and died, they loved and they suffered, in a world that was lit not by the grand public floodlights of a Roman forum, but by the small, flickering, and intimate glow of the domestic hearth. To truly understand this age, we must adjust our eyes to this different quality of light. We must look not for the bright, hard glare of classical reason, but for the softer, more mysterious, and more deeply human glow of faith, of art, and of a quiet, stubborn, and enduring resilience. The ages were not dark, they were simply lit by a different kind of moon.
The glow of the monastery. In the vast, often turbulent and uncertain landscape of the Dark Ages, there existed islands of profound peace, of disciplined order, and of a quiet, burning light. These were the monasteries. From the windswept, rocky shores of Ireland to the sun-baked hills of Italy, these self-contained communities of monks were the guardians of a flame that had been all but extinguished in the outside world, the flame of knowledge. To step through the stone gate of a monastery was to enter a world that operated on a different rhythm, a world dedicated not to war or to survival, but to the glory of God and the preservation of the written word. Imagine a scriptorium, the writing room of a monastery, on a cold winter's night. The world outside is a realm of absolute darkness and biting wind. But here, in this small, stone-walled room, there is a quiet, focused warmth. The only light comes from a series of tallow candles or small oil lamps, their flames casting a soft, golden, and flickering glow on the scene. The air is still, and it smells of old parchment, of beeswax, of the sharp, earthy scent of ink, and of the faint, sweet perfume of incense that drifts in from the adjoining chapel.
A dozen monks are at work. They are hunched over tall, sloping wooden desks. They are not robed in the rough, simple wool of the peasant. Their habits are of a finer, darker cloth. They do not speak. The rule of the scriptorium is one of absolute silence. The only sounds are the gentle scratching of a sharpened quill pen on the surface of a prepared animal skin, the soft rustle of a page being turned, and the occasional, almost inaudible sigh of a man deep in concentration. Each monk is engaged in a sacred and incredibly laborious task, the copying of a book. In an age before the printing press, every single book was a handmade object, a work of art, a vessel of immense and precious knowledge. The book being copied might be a copy of the Bible, the Word of God, the most important text of all. It might be the writings of one of the early church fathers, like St. Augustine or St. Jerome. Or it might be a text from a world that was now lost, a work of classical antiquity, the poetry of Virgil, the history of Livy, the philosophy of Boethius, a pagan text that was deemed worthy of preservation for its wisdom or its beauty. The process is painstakingly slow. The monk or scribe must first rule the page, using a sharp point to create faint, invisible lines to guide his lettering. Then, with a quill pen, which he has carefully cut and sharpened himself, he begins the work of copying, his eyes moving back and forth between the original manuscript, the exemplar, and his own fresh page. His script is a thing of beauty and precision, a formal, elegant hand like the insular majuscule of the Irish monks or the clear, readable Carolingian minuscule that would become the basis for our own lowercase alphabet. He works for hours on end, his back aching, his eyes straining in the poor light. A single page can take a full day to complete. A single book can take a year or more. But the work is not just about copying the words. It is also about beautifying them. The most important manuscripts are illuminated. Another monk, the illuminator, a master artist, will then take the completed text and adorn it with vibrant, jewel-like colors made from ground-up minerals and plants, and with delicate applications of real gold leaf that will catch the candlelight and seem to glow with an inner fire. He will create intricate, abstract carpet-like pages of interwoven knotwork. He will draw the first letter of a chapter as a huge, elaborate, and fantastical creation, a letter that is also a picture, a historiated initial, perhaps showing a scene from the life of a saint or a mythical beast entwined in the foliage. These monks are not just copyists, they are the librarians, the scholars, and the publishers of their age. They are engaged in a conscious and desperate act of cultural preservation. They see the world outside their stone walls as a place of chaos, of violence, of ignorance. They believe that they have been tasked by God with a sacred duty to gather up the scattered, fragile fragments of wisdom from a shattered world and to preserve them in the safe, holy ark of the monastery. The glow of the candles in the scriptorium is more than just a source of light for their work. It is a symbol of what they are doing. In a world that seemed to be descending into darkness, these quiet, patient, and dedicated men were tending to a small but persistent flame. They were keeping the light of knowledge alive, so that it might one day be used to illuminate the world once more.
Lost knowledge found again. The image of the Dark Ages as a time of catastrophic intellectual loss is a powerful one. We think of the great library of Alexandria, a repository of the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world, burning, and with it, a huge portion of our human heritage turning to smoke and ash.
We think of the complex engineering of the Roman aqueducts, the sophisticated philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, the astronomical calculations of Ptolemy, all of it seemingly forgotten, replaced by a world of superstition and dogma. And while there is a kernel of truth in this image, the story of knowledge in the Dark Ages is not a simple one of loss. It is a more complex and fascinating story of preservation, of translation, and of a slow, often indirect journey back into the light. The loss was, without doubt, immense. The collapse of the Roman educational system meant that the widespread literacy and the intellectual infrastructure that had sustained a high level of philosophical and scientific inquiry simply vanished in the West. The knowledge of the Greek language, the language of the great philosophers and scientists of antiquity, became exceedingly rare. The great works of Plato, of the Greek tragedians, of the early mathematicians became inaccessible, their texts untranslated and unread.
Much practical knowledge was also lost. The recipe for Roman concrete, a building material of incredible durability, was forgotten. The complex techniques of Roman road building, of central heating, of large-scale civic engineering, these skills atrophied and disappeared in a world that no longer had the centralized state or the economic surplus to support such projects. The world, in many practical ways, became a simpler, less technologically sophisticated place. However, the idea of a total and complete loss is a myth. Knowledge was not so much lost as it was displaced and transformed. The centers of intellectual gravity shifted. While Western Europe was experiencing a period of relative decline, other parts of the world were flourishing. The most important of these was the Islamic world. From the 8th century onwards, the great cities of the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, became the world's leading centers of science, medicine, and philosophy. Arab scholars embarked on a massive, state-sponsored project to translate the great works of the Greek thinkers into Arabic. They did not just preserve this knowledge, they built upon it. They made revolutionary advances in mathematics, inventing algebra and popularizing the system of Hindu-Arabic numerals that we use today. They made groundbreaking discoveries in medicine, in optics, in astronomy. The great libraries of Baghdad and Cordoba were far larger and more comprehensive than any that existed in Western Christendom.
Another crucial center of preservation was the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire which had not collapsed. In its capital, Constantinople, the knowledge of the Greek language and the tradition of classical scholarship had never been broken. Byzantine scholars continued to read, to copy, and to comment upon the works of the ancient masters. The knowledge that had been lost to the West was not gone forever. It was simply waiting, in other languages and in other lands, for the moment to return. And the process of its return was a slow and gradual one, beginning in the very heart of the Dark Ages. It happened in the places where these different cultures met. In Spain, in the multicultural cities of Toledo and Córdoba, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars lived and worked side by side, a great translation movement began in the 11th and 12th centuries. Christian scholars began to translate the great works of Aristotle, of Euclid, of Ptolemy, from Arabic into Latin, reintroducing them to the West. They were not just recovering the lost works of the Greeks, they were also discovering the immense intellectual achievements of the Islamic world itself, the works of scholars like Avicenna and Averroes.
It happened in Italy through the trade contacts with the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine scholars and their precious Greek manuscripts began to trickle into Italy, reintroducing the direct study of the Greek language and its rich philosophical tradition. The story of knowledge in the Dark Ages is therefore not a simple narrative of a fall and a rebirth. It is a story of a great global conversation, a story of the migration of ideas. The light of classical learning was not extinguished. it was simply passed from one hand to another, from the Greeks to the Romans, from the Romans to the Arabs and the Byzantines, and then, slowly and patiently, back to the Latin West. The monasteries of the West played their crucial role in preserving what they could of the Latin tradition, but the full recovery of the ancient inheritance was an international and multicultural achievement, a testament to the enduring and resilient power of the human quest for knowledge. The lives of ordinary villagers. The grand histories of the Dark Ages are written in the language of kings and popes, of battles and theological disputes. They are chronicles of the great and the powerful. But the vast, silent majority of the people who lived and died in this era were none of these things. They were the ordinary villagers, the peasants, the farmers, whose lives were not recorded in any great manuscript, but were written in the soil, in the rhythm of the seasons, and in the quiet, unceasing cycle of labor and survival. To understand their world is to step away from the castles and the cathedrals and into the smoky, earth-floored reality of a peasant's hut. Imagine a small village, a cluster of a dozen or so simple, timber-framed huts with thatched roofs, huddled around a small stone church and a muddy central green. This is the entire world for the people who live here. The horizon, marked by a line of low, wooded hills, is the edge of their known universe. Their lives are governed by a deep, intimate, and often brutal relationship with the land that surrounds them. The life of a peasant is a life of relentless physical labor. The day begins before dawn with the rekindling of the fire and a meager breakfast of coarse bread and weak ale. Then it is out to the fields. The land is not owned by the peasants. It belongs to the local lord, who lives in the manor house on the hill. The peasants are his tenants, his serfs, bound to the land by a complex web of obligation. They farm their own small, allotted strips of land in the great, open fields, but they must also work a certain number of days each week on the lord's personal land, the domain, without pay. A significant portion of their own harvest must be given to the Lord as rent, and another tenth must be given to the church as the tithe. Their labor supports the entire social pyramid that rests upon their bent backs. The work is backbreaking and is performed with simple, inefficient tools. The heavy-wheeled plow, pulled by a team of slow, plodding oxen, is a precious and often communally owned piece of equipment. Most of the work is done with hand tools: the sickle for reaping, the scythe for mowing, the hoe for weeding. The peasant's body is their primary machine, and it is a machine that is often aching, undernourished, and worn out by the time they reach middle age. The family is the essential economic unit. Everyone works. The men perform the heavy labor of plowing and harvesting. The women are responsible for the indoor work, which is just as grueling. Grinding the grain with a hand quern, baking the bread, brewing the ale, spinning the wool and weaving it into cloth, tending to the small vegetable garden behind the hut, and, of course, raising the children. The children, as soon as they are old enough to walk, are given their own chores: scaring the birds from the crops, gathering firewood, tending to the family's pig or chickens. Life is lived in public, in close proximity to one's neighbors. The open field system means that you work alongside the same families every day. The village is a place of intense social scrutiny, where everyone knows everyone else's business. This creates a strong sense of community and mutual support. Neighbors will help each other during the harvest or in times of sickness. But it can also be a place of simmering resentments, of disputes over land boundaries, of gossip and suspicion. Their world is one of deep faith, but it is a faith that is interwoven with an older, deeper layer of folk belief and superstition. They believe in the Christian God,
But they also believe in the goblins that live in the woods, in the healing power of certain sacred springs, in the lucky charms that can ward off the evil eye. Their understanding of the world is not scientific, it is magical and cyclical. The life of the ordinary villager is a life of profound hardship, of constant labor, of deep insecurity. They are at the mercy of the weather, of the harvest, of the Lord, of the ever-present threat of sickness and famine. But it is not a life without its moments of joy, the celebration of a good harvest, the feast day of a local saint, the birth of a healthy child, the simple, profound pleasure of a warm fire on a cold night. Their lives may be absent from the grand chronicles, but it was their quiet, stubborn, and enduring labor that formed the true and largely invisible foundation of the entire medieval world.
Nightfall in a medieval town. As the sun begins its slow descent, painting the western sky in shades of bruised purple and faded gold, a profound and ancient transformation begins in the medieval town. The bustling, noisy, and chaotic world of the day, with its crowded markets and its busy workshops, prepares to surrender to the very different world of the night. Nightfall is not just a transition from light to dark, it is a retreat, a lockdown, a collective drawing in of breath in the face of a darkness that is filled with both real and imagined dangers. The first signal of the coming night is the ringing of the curfew bell from the tower of the main church. The word curfew, from the Old French couvre-feu, or cover the fire, is a literal command. It is the signal for every household to damp down its domestic fire, to cover the embers with ash, to prevent a stray spark from igniting a catastrophic blaze in the tightly packed, timber-framed town. But it is also a signal for the town to begin sealing itself off from the outside world.
The great iron-studded wooden gates of the town walls are swung shut with a groan, and the heavy bars are dropped into place. The drawbridge over the moat is raised, its chains rattling in the twilight. The town is now a fortress, a sealed container against the lawless, untamed world of the countryside. No one may enter or leave until the gates are opened again at sunrise. Within the walls, a similar process of sealing and securing is taking place on a smaller scale. The merchants in the market square pack up their wares and shutter their stalls. The artisans lock the heavy wooden doors of their workshops. And in the narrow, overhanging houses that line the streets, the families prepare for the long night ahead. The heavy wooden shutters on the unglazed windows are closed and barred, not just to keep out the cold, but to create a barrier against the perceived dangers of the night air and the prying eyes of strangers. The front door is barred from the inside. Each house becomes its own small private fortress.
The streets, which during the day were a river of humanity, now fall silent and empty. The only legitimate presence in the streets after dark is the town watch. This is not a professional police force, but a group of citizens performing their required duty in rotation. They walk in small groups, carrying a flickering lantern and armed with a simple staff or a halberd. Their job is to patrol the dark, empty lanes, to be on the lookout for fires, to challenge any person they find out after the curfew, and to be a deterrent to the thieves and the cutthroats who thrive in the darkness. Their periodic, lonely cry, "All's well!" is a small, reassuring sound in the profound silence. For the ordinary citizen, safely locked in their home, the night is a time of fear and superstition.
The darkness is not just an absence of light, it is a presence, a force. It is the time when the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural worlds grow thin. The howling of the wind is not just the wind, it could be the cry of a restless spirit. The creak of a floorboard is not just the house settling, it could be the footstep of a demon. The night is populated with a host of malevolent beings from folklore and from faith. The only light comes from the domestic hearth or from a single sputtering tallow candle. This small, fragile flame creates a tiny, warm, golden bubble of safety in the vast, cold ocean of the night. The family huddles close to it, speaking in low voices, telling stories to pass the time and to keep the fear at bay. To live through a night in a medieval town is to experience a world that is fundamentally different from our own. It is to know a darkness that is almost absolute, a silence that is almost complete, and a sense of vulnerability that is palpable. It is to understand that the night is not just a time for sleep, but a separate kingdom, a place of fear, of magic, and of a deep, primal need for the simple, reassuring safety of a barred door and a flickering fire.
The church as shelter. In the often chaotic, uncertain, and dangerous world of the Dark Ages, there was one institution that stood as a symbol of permanence, of order, and of hope. It was the church, and the physical embodiment of the church's power and promise was the church building itself. From the smallest, humblest, stone and timber parish church in a remote village, to the great, soaring cathedrals that were beginning to rise in the larger towns, the church was more than just a place of worship. It was a shelter, a fortress, a sanctuary for both the body and the soul. Imagine a traveler, a pilgrim, walking on a muddy, dangerous road. He is cold, he is tired, he is fearful. And then, in the distance, through the mist, he sees it. The stone tower of a church or a monastery. The sight is a profound relief. It is a landmark, a signpost, a promise of safety in a wild and lawless landscape. To reach the church is to reach a place of sanctuary. The concept of sanctuary was a real and legally recognized one. A fugitive, a criminal fleeing from justice, could claim sanctuary by entering a church. As long as he remained within its consecrated walls, he was, in theory, protected from arrest and from the secular authorities. The church was a pocket of divine law, a place where the king's law did not hold absolute sway.
For the ordinary villager, the parish church was the center of their world. It was almost certainly the only stone building they had ever entered. Its thick, solid walls and its high, dark, timbered roof gave it a feeling of immense and comforting permanence, a stark contrast to their own fragile mud and wattle huts. To step inside was to enter a different world. The air inside was cool, still, and smelled of old stone, of beeswax, and of the sweet, otherworldly scent of incense. The light was dim, filtering through the small, high, unglazed windows, creating a sense of mystery and reverence. The space was dominated by the great rugged stone font, where every child in the village was baptized, their soul cleansed of original sin. It was dominated by the simple wooden altar, upon which the priest would perform the miraculous ritual of the Mass, transforming the bread and the wine into the body and blood of Christ.
The church was a place of awe. The walls might be covered with faded, painted images of the saints, of the angels, of the terrifying tortures of hell and the serene bliss of heaven. For an illiterate congregation, these paintings were their Bible, their theology, their visual guide to the great, invisible drama of salvation. The priest, speaking in a Latin they did not understand, was their intermediary.
their connection to the vast, mysterious power of God. But the church was also a practical shelter. In times of attack, during a Viking raid or a dispute between local lords, the entire village would flee to the church. Its thick stone walls and its heavy barred door made it the most defensible building in the settlement. The church tower could be used as a lookout post and a final refuge. The church was a literal fortress, a place where the community would huddle together, praying for deliverance as the sounds of violence raged outside.
It was also the storehouse of the community's collective memory. The churchyard that surrounded it was the final resting place of their ancestors. The festivals of the Christian year, which were celebrated in and around the church, marked the passage of time and provided a structure for their lives. The church was the place of all the great life cycle events, the baptisms, the marriages, the funerals. It was the silent, stone witness to the entire story of their lives. In a world defined by fragility and uncertainty, the church was a rock. It was a mountain of stone and a mountain of faith. It offered the promise of eternal salvation in the next world, and it offered a very real, very solid, and very necessary shelter in this one.
The superstitions of the Dark Ages. The world of the Dark Ages was a world that was deeply and profoundly Christian. The teachings of the church, the stories of the Bible, the lives of the saints, these formed the official overarching framework for understanding the universe. But beneath this formal layer of Christian faith, there existed an older, deeper, and more chaotic world of belief. It was a world of folk magic, of pagan remnants, of superstitions and charms that governed the small, practical details of daily life. For the ordinary person, there was no contradiction between these two worlds. They were woven together into a single complex tapestry of belief. This world of superstition was born from a deep intimacy with the natural world and from an equally deep sense of vulnerability. In an age without science, without modern medicine, without any real control over the forces of nature, life was a precarious and unpredictable affair. The crops could fail, the cattle could sicken, a child could be struck down by a sudden fever. In the face of these constant, inexplicable threats, people sought to find some measure of control, some way of influencing their fate through the use of magic and ritual. The world was seen as being alive with supernatural forces, with spirits and entities that were not part of the Christian cosmology. The deep, dark woods were the home of goblins, elves, and the fae folk, powerful and capricious beings who could be either helpful or malevolent. A sudden sickness in a cow might be blamed on an elf shot, an invisible arrow fired by a mischievous elf. A baby that was born sickly or deformed might be seen as a changeling, a fairy child left in place of a stolen human one. Certain places were imbued with a powerful pre-Christian magic. An ancient, gnarled oak tree, a bubbling spring, a circle of standing stones. These were places where the veil between the human world and the other world was thin. People would go to these places to leave offerings, to make wishes, to seek healing. They might tie a small strip of cloth, a kludi, to the branch of a sacred tree, believing that as the cloth rotted away, their sickness would rot away with it.
To navigate this magically charged world, people relied on a vast and complex body of folk wisdom. They knew which herbs could be used to make a healing poultice, and which could be used to make a love potion. They knew the charms and the incantations that had to be spoken to ward off the evil eye, or to ensure a good harvest. They knew the auspicious times to plant their crops, based on the phases of the moon. The world was full of omens. The sudden appearance of a single magpie was a sign of bad luck. The hoot of an owl during the day was a portent of death. A dream of falling teeth meant the loss of a loved one. People were constantly reading the world around them for these secret signs, for clues to the hidden intentions of the invisible forces that governed their lives. The church fought a constant and often losing battle against these beliefs. The priests would preach against them, calling them the remnants of paganism, the work of the devil. But they could never fully eradicate them. Instead, a strange and fascinating process of syncretism occurred. The old beliefs were often absorbed and Christianized. A sacred well, once dedicated to a pagan water goddess, would be rededicated to the Virgin Mary. But the ritual of leaving offerings at the well would continue. An old herbal remedy would be given a new Christian charm to be spoken over it. For the ordinary person, this was not a world of conflicting beliefs. It was a single, unified reality. A world where one would pray to a Christian saint for healing, but also wear a pagan amulet for protection. It was a world where faith and fear, where dogma and magic were inextricably and powerfully intertwined.
The Plague Years. Let us now walk into the deepest and most terrifying shadow of the medieval world. Let us speak of the great pestilence, the Black Death, which arrived in Europe in the middle of the 14th century. It was a catastrophe of such unimaginable scale that it is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. It was not just a disease, it was an apocalypse, an event that shattered the foundations of society and left a permanent, traumatic scar on the soul of a civilization. Imagine a thriving port city. The streets are crowded, the markets are bustling, the air is filled with the sounds of life and commerce. And then a trading ship arrives from the east. It carries a cargo of silk, of spices, and of something else, something unseen and deadly. It carries the rats, and on the rats it carries the fleas, and in the fleas it carries the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The first deaths are quiet, isolated events, dismissed as the usual fevers of the crowded city. But then the pattern emerges, and the whispers begin. The sickness is a strange and terrible one. It begins with a raging fever and a profound, bone-deep weariness. And then comes the sign, the horrifying, unmistakable signature of the disease, the bubo. A hard, swollen, and excruciatingly painful lump appears in the groin, the armpit, or the neck. The skin around it turns a dark, bruised, purplish black. Death, in most cases, follows within a few agonizing days.
Fear, a cold and suffocating fog, descends upon the city. The bonds of human society, which had seemed so strong, dissolve with terrifying speed. People abandon their own families. A husband will flee from his sick wife. A mother will refuse to tend to her own dying child. The fear of the contagion is stronger than the bonds of love and duty. The city grinds to a halt. The markets empty. The workshops fall silent. The streets become desolate, haunted spaces. The only sounds are the wails of the bereaved from behind shuttered windows, and the constant, monotonous, and soul-destroying tolling of the church bells, a sound that no longer marks the time, but simply counts the dead. The authorities are helpless. The doctors, with their theories of bad air and their useless, often harmful remedies of bloodletting and strange potions, can do nothing. The priests, who bravely enter the houses of the sick to offer last rites, die in huge numbers, their faith no protection against the pestilence. The sheer number of the dead overwhelms the ancient rituals of burial. The churchyards are filled within weeks. The city resorts to a new, horrifying solution, the plague pit.
A great open trench is dug outside the city walls, and each night the death carts, piled high with the anonymous, shrouded bodies of the dead, arrive to tip their grim cargo into the earth. There is no ceremony, no prayer, just the grim, mechanical efficiency of mass disposal.
The plague is a fire that burns through the city, and then it moves on, carried along the trade routes, the rivers, the pilgrim paths, into the countryside. It moves from town to town, from village to village, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. In the space of 5 years, it kills an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population of Europe. The world that emerges from the other side of the plague is a shattered one. It is a world of empty villages, of untended fields, of widows and orphans. It is a world haunted by an almost unimaginable loss. But it is also a world that has been profoundly and permanently changed. The catastrophic loss of life will lead to a shortage of labor, which will give a new and unprecedented power to the surviving peasants, and will ultimately lead to the collapse of the old feudal system. The failure of the church to stop the plague will lead to a deep crisis of faith that will pave the way for the Reformation. But for those who lived through it, these long-term consequences are irrelevant. Their world is one of trauma, of grief, and of a deep existential dread. They have looked into the abyss. They have witnessed the fragility of their civilization, and they are left to walk as survivors through a quiet, empty, and profoundly haunted landscape.
Firelight gatherings. The day is done. The hard, physical labor in the fields is over. The last of the meager evening meal has been eaten. The heavy wooden door of the hut has been barred, and the shutters have been closed against the deep, impenetrable darkness of the rural night. The world now shrinks to the small, intimate, and magical space created by the fire on the central hearth. This is the time for the family to gather, to draw close to the only source of warmth and light, and to reaffirm the bonds that hold them together against the harshness of their world. The fire is a living presence in the room. It crackles and hisses, its flames a constant, hypnotic dance of orange, yellow, and red. It casts a warm golden glow on the rough, smoke-blackened walls of the hut and on the faces of the family members who are huddled around it. The light is soft and alive, making the familiar faces seem more mysterious, their expressions more profound. The corners of the room are lost in deep, moving shadows, a darkness that is populated by the imagination. This is the time when the work of the hands gives way to the work of the mouth. In a world where most people are illiterate, the spoken word is the primary vessel of culture, of history, of entertainment, and of education. The firelight gathering is the school, the theater, and the library of the peasant family.
The grandfather, his face a creased and weathered map of a long and difficult life, might be the storyteller of the evening. His voice is a low, raspy rumble, and he tells the old stories, the ones he heard from his own grandfather. He tells the stories of the saints, of their miracles, of their heroic martyrdoms. He tells the stories from the Bible, of David and Goliath, of Noah and the flood. Stories that reinforce the moral and spiritual framework of their lives. But he also tells the other stories, the older, darker tales that had been passed down from a time before the church bells rang. He tells of the heroes and the monsters of the pagan past, of Beowulf and Grendel, of dragons and their hoards of gold. He tells the local tales, the stories of the mischievous goblins who live in the nearby woods, of the beautiful but dangerous spirits who inhabit the marshes, of the great black dog, the Barghest, whose appearance is a portent of death, These stories are a form of entertainment, but they are also a form of warning, a way of teaching the children about the dangers that lie beyond the safe, familiar circle of the village.
The mother, her hands never still even in rest, might be spinning wool with a simple drop spindle, her fingers a blur of practiced motion. She might sing a lullaby to the baby on her lap, a simple, repetitive melody that is as old as the hills. Or she might lead the family in a simple evening prayer, a quiet, murmured thanks to God for having survived another day. The children sit close to the fire, their eyes wide in the flickering light, their imaginations ignited by the stories. They are learning the foundational narratives of their culture. They are learning what to believe, what to fear, and what it means to be a part of their family, their village, their people. The firelight gathering is a sanctuary. It is a place of shared warmth against the physical cold of the night. It is a place of shared stories against the psychological darkness of a hard and often frightening world. It is a small, fragile, and deeply human bubble of light and community, a testament to the enduring power of the family and the spoken word to create a home in the midst of the vast, silent, and often menacing darkness.
Pilgrims on the road. In the landscape of the Dark Ages, the roads are arteries of both commerce and faith. And among the most common and distinctive figures to be found on these muddy, dangerous tracks are the pilgrims. They are men and women, rich and poor, old and young, who have undertaken a long and arduous journey for a single powerful purpose, to come closer to God. The pilgrimage is one of the great defining experiences of the medieval world, an act of extreme devotion, a search for a miracle, and a profound adventure of the soul. A pilgrimage begins with a vow. A person might be suffering from an incurable sickness, and they vow that if they are healed, they will make a journey to the shrine of a particular saint. A knight might be facing a dangerous battle, and he vows to go on pilgrimage if he survives. A person might be weighed down by a terrible sin, and they undertake the journey as a form of penance, hoping to find forgiveness at a holy site.
The pilgrim is an easily recognizable figure. They wear a simple, coarse, woolen tunic. They carry a long wooden staff to help them on the rough roads and to ward off dogs or bandits. They wear a wide-brimmed hat to protect them from the sun and the rain. And they wear a badge, a sign, that identifies their destination. A pilgrim going to Rome might have a badge of the Keys of St. Peter. A pilgrim going to Santiago de Compostela in Spain would have a scallop shell sewn to their hat or their cloak. The journey itself is a long and perilous ordeal. The roads are in a terrible state of disrepair. The pilgrim must walk for hundreds or even thousands of miles, their feet often bare or clad in simple leather sandals. They sleep in the open or in the simple, crowded hospices that are run by monasteries along the major pilgrim routes. They are at the mercy of the weather, of the bandits who prey on travelers, of the diseases that are rife in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the road. To go on pilgrimage is to willingly embrace a life of hardship and uncertainty.
But it is also an experience of profound community. The pilgrims travel together in large groups for safety and for companionship. They come from all over Christendom, speaking a dozen different languages, but they are united by their shared faith and their common goal. They share their food, they tend to each other's blisters, they sing hymns together as they walk. The road becomes a moving community, a temporary society where the normal distinctions of class and nationality are softened by the shared experience of the journey. The destination of the pilgrimage is a shrine, a place made holy by its connection to a saint. It might be the tomb of a great saint, like St. Peter in Rome or St. James in Compostela. It might be a place that holds a holy relic, a bone from a saint's finger, a piece of the true cross,
a vial of the Virgin Mary's milk. These relics are believed to be imbued with a powerful divine energy, a direct conduit to the healing and forgiving power of God.
When the pilgrim finally arrives at the shrine, after weeks or months of travel, the experience is an overwhelming one. They enter the great incense-filled church. They join the throng of other pilgrims, pressing forward to get a glimpse of the sacred relic. They kneel, they pray, they leave a small offering. They may be overcome with emotion, weeping with a mixture of exhaustion, of relief, and of a profound sense of spiritual fulfillment. Whether or not they receive the miracle they came for, the pilgrimage changes them. They have stepped outside their ordinary lives. They have seen the wider world. They have endured hardship, and they have persevered. They return to their small village a different person, with a story to tell, a holy relic of their own, and a deep, quiet sense of having walked, for a time, a little closer to heaven.
The Lords of the Manor. High on a hill, overlooking the village and the patchwork of open fields, stands the manor house. It is a building that is fundamentally different from the humble, earth-bound huts of the peasants below. It is a structure of stone and thick, dark timber, a building designed not just for shelter, but for defense, for administration, and for the conspicuous display of power. This is the world of the Lord, the man who sits at the apex of your small rural universe, a figure of immense authority, of great wealth, and of a life that is governed by a complex and often heavy code of duty and honor. The Lord is a warrior. His primary role in the feudal system is to provide military service to his own overlord, the great baron or the king himself. He holds his land, his manor, in exchange for this service. He must be ready at a moment's notice to arm himself, to mount his great war horse, and to lead his contingent of men-at-arms into battle. His hall is decorated not with gentle landscapes, but with the tools of his trade, with shields, with swords, with spears, with the antlers of the stags he has killed in the hunt, which is itself a form of military training. His life is governed by a strict code of chivalry, a set of ideals that emphasize courage, loyalty, and honor. But the reality is often more brutal. The Lord's world is one of violence, of petty wars with his neighbors over land boundaries, of ruthless ambition in the competitive and dangerous world of court politics. He must be both a warrior and a politician, a man who can wield a sword as effectively as he can negotiate a marriage alliance. But the Lord is also an administrator. He is the CEO of a large and complex agricultural enterprise. The manor is not just his home, it is the center of an economic engine that produces the wealth upon which his entire lifestyle depends. He must oversee the farming of his own personal lands, the demesne. He must ensure that his tenants, the serfs, are performing their required labor services. He must manage the manor's resources, the woodlands, the pastures, the mill, the fish pond. He is also the judge. He presides over the manorial court, which is held in the great hall of his house. It is his job to settle the disputes between his tenants, to punish the petty crimes of the village, to enforce the customs of the manor. He is the law. His word is final. His power over the lives of the peasants who live on his land is almost absolute.
The great hall is the stage upon which his power is performed. It is a cavernous, high-ceilinged room with a massive fireplace at one end and a raised dais at the other. It is here that he holds his court. It is here that he receives his rents and his dues. And it is here that he feasts. The feast is a powerful political tool. It is a way of displaying his wealth and his generosity.
He sits at the high table, looking down on his household, his retainers, his tenants, all of whom are dependent on him for their food and their protection. He is the patriarch, the provider, the master of his domain. But his life is not one of pure leisure. It is a life of immense and often heavy responsibility. He is responsible for the defense of his people. He is responsible for the productivity of his land. He is responsible for the spiritual well-being of his soul and the honor of his lineage. He is a single, powerful link in the great feudal chain that binds the king to the commoner. His life is one of privilege, of power, of wealth. But it is also a life that is lived under the constant heavy weight of duty, in a world where a single weak link can cause the entire chain to break.
Castles at night. The castle is the ultimate symbol of the Dark Ages. It is a mountain of stone, a monument to a world defined by violence, by power, and by a deep, pervasive sense of insecurity. During the day, it is a bustling, noisy center of military and administrative life. But as night falls and the great gates are barred, the castle is transformed. It becomes a vast, silent, and deeply mysterious place, a stone behemoth slumbering under the moon, its halls and corridors filled with echoes, with shadows, and with the weight of its own immense, brooding presence. Imagine you are a guest, a traveler given shelter for the night in a great stone castle. The evening feast in the great hall is over. The fires have been banked. The lord and his family have retired to their private chambers in the keep. You are led by a servant carrying a single, flickering torch through a labyrinth of dark, cold, and echoing corridors.
The air in these corridors is still and frigid. The stone walls, which have absorbed the day's chill, seem to actively radiate cold, a damp, penetrating chill that makes you pull your cloak tighter around you. The only sound is the soft shuffling of your own shoes on the stone floor and the echo of your footsteps, which seems to follow you like a ghostly companion. The torchlight casts a small, trembling circle of orange light, but beyond it, the darkness is absolute. The light makes the shadows dance and writhe, transforming the familiar shapes of doorways and archways into the mouths of dark, menacing caves. You are shown to your chamber, a small, sparsely furnished room carved out of the immense thickness of the castle wall. The servant lights a single tallow candle and then leaves you. Closing the heavy oak door behind him, the sound of the iron bolts sliding into place on the outside of your door is a sound of both security and imprisonment. You are safe, but you are also trapped. The room is a cell of cold stone. The only opening to the outside world is a narrow, unglazed arrow slit, through which you can hear the mournful, lonely sound of the wind moaning around the battlements. The only furniture is a simple wooden bed with a straw mattress, a stool, and a chest. The candle flame flutters and dances in the constant, invisible drafts that seem to flow through the very stone itself. You lie in the bed, under a pile of heavy, damp-feeling woolen blankets. The cold from the stone seems to seep up into the mattress, into your bones. Sleep is a long time coming. The castle is not a silent place at night. It is a living, breathing entity, and it has its own nocturnal language. You hear the creak and groan of the ancient roof timbers. You hear the frantic, almost inaudible scratching of a rat within the thick, hollow walls. You hear the distant, echoing cry of the watchman from the battlements, a lonely human sound that is both reassuring and a reminder of the need for constant vigilance. You look at the way the candlelight plays on the rough, uneven surface of the stone walls. You think of the history that these stones have witnessed. The battles, the sieges, the births, the deaths, the secret plots whispered in these very corridors.
the castle feels saturated with the past, with the ghosts of all the people who have lived and died within its walls. The castle at night is a place of profound and unsettling atmosphere. It is a place that makes you feel very small, very mortal, and very much alone. It is a vast, cold, and silent stone guardian, a sleeping giant that dreams of a long and violent history, its secrets locked away forever in its dark, echoing heart.
The Viking Shadow. For the people of the early medieval period, particularly those living in the coastal regions of Britain, of Ireland, and of Francia, there was one fear that overshadowed all others. It was not the fear of a bad harvest, or of sickness, or of the local lord. It was a fear that came from the sea. It was the fear of the Northmen, the Vikings. It was the fear of the sudden, terrifying appearance of a long, serpentine dragon ship on the horizon. The Viking raids, which began in the late 8th century, were a new and horrifying form of warfare. They were not the predictable, seasonal campaigns of feudal armies. They were swift, brutal, and utterly unpredictable. The Vikings were masters of the sea. Their longships, with their shallow draft, were marvels of naval engineering. They could cross the wild, open ocean of the North Sea, but they could also navigate far up the shallowest of rivers, allowing them to strike deep into the heart of a kingdom, at places that had never before known the threat of attack.
Imagine you are a monk living in a peaceful, prosperous, and seemingly safe monastery on the coast of Northumbria, a place like Lindisfarne. Your life is one of quiet, ordered prayer and of scholarly work in the scriptorium. Your monastery is wealthy, filled with the gifts of pious kings and nobles, golden chalices, silver crucifixes, beautifully illuminated manuscripts. It is a treasure house of God, and it is completely undefended. One morning, as you are walking in the cloister garden, you see it. A single, sleek, black ship, its high carved prow in the shape of a dragon's head, its single, square, red and white striped sail taut in the wind. And then another appears, and another. A feeling of cold, sickening dread grips you. You have heard the stories, the rumors from the continent, but you have never believed they could be true. The monks run to the church to pray for a miracle, to bar the great wooden doors. But the doors are no match for the axes of the Northmen. The Vikings swarm ashore. They are not a disciplined army, they are a ferocious war band. They are large, bearded men armed with long-bladed axes, with swords, with spears. They wear helmets, some with nasal guards, and they carry round, brightly painted wooden shields. They move with a terrifying speed and a brutal efficiency. They are not interested in conquest. They are interested in portable wealth. They storm the church. They kill the monks who stand in their way. They desecrate the altar. They are pagans, and they have no respect for the sacred symbols of your faith. They smash open the chests. They rip the jewels from the covers of the holy books. They stuff the golden chalices and the silver plates into sacks. They are also interested in another kind of treasure, slaves. They round up the younger monks, the boys from the monastery school, the local villagers who have fled to the monastery for protection. They bind their hands, they yoke them together, and they herd them back to the ships. These people will be taken back to Scandinavia to be sold in the slave markets of Hedeby or Birka, their lives destroyed, their families never to see them again. The raid is over as quickly as it began. Within a few hours, the longships are gone, disappearing back over the horizon, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable devastation. The monastery is a smoldering ruin. The church has been looted and burned. The precious manuscripts have been torn apart, their beautiful illuminated pages scattered in the wind. The ground is littered with the bodies of the slaughtered monks, their white habits stained with blood. The raid is over as quickly as it began. Within a few hours, the longships are gone, disappearing back over the horizon, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable devastation. The monastery is a smoldering ruin. The church has been looted and burned. The precious manuscripts have been torn apart, their beautiful illuminated pages scattered in the wind. The ground is littered with the bodies of the slaughtered monks, their white habits stained with blood. The Viking shadow would hang over the coastal peoples of Europe for more than 2 centuries. It was a shadow of sudden, unpredictable, and savage violence. It forced kings to build navies, to construct fortified towns, or to pay the humiliating tribute known as the Danegeld. It was a terror that came from the sea, a reminder that even in a world of stone castles and powerful lords, civilization was a fragile and vulnerable thing, always at the mercy of the dragon ships that could appear without warning from the cold gray mists of the north.
Peasant revolts and whispers of change. The world of the peasant is one of deep, ingrained subservience. From birth, you are taught to accept your place in the great, divinely ordained chain of being. You are taught to obey your lord, to pay your dues, to work the land without complaint. The social order is as fixed and as unchangeable as the stars in the sky. But sometimes, when the pressure becomes too great, when the injustices become too heavy to bear, even this ancient and powerful order can be shaken. Sometimes the voiceless find their voice, and the whispers of discontent can swell into a roar of open rebellion. The life of a peasant is a life lived on the very edge of subsistence. But in the years following the Black Death, a strange and unexpected thing happened. The catastrophic loss of life had created a massive labor shortage, and for the first time, the surviving peasants found themselves in a position of power. They could demand higher wages, better conditions. They could move from one manor to another, seeking the best possible terms. For a brief moment, the balance of power had shifted.
But the ruling classes, the lords and the king, were terrified by this new reality. They saw it as a threat to the very foundations of their world, and so they fought back. They passed laws, like the Statute of Laborers in England, which attempted to fix wages at their old pre-plague levels. They tried to reimpose the old feudal duties to bind the peasants to the land once more. They levied new and punishing taxes, like the poll tax, to pay for their endless wars. For the peasantry, this was a bitter betrayal. They had survived the great pestilence. They had seen a glimmer of a better, freer life, and now their masters were trying to snatch it away from them, to push them back down into the mire of serfdom. A deep and simmering anger began to spread through the villages and the fields. This anger was given a voice by a new kind of figure, the radical, itinerant preacher. Men like John Ball in England, who were often excommunicated priests, traveled the countryside, preaching a dangerous and revolutionary gospel. They spoke not of obedience, but of equality. They preached that in the eyes of God, the peasant was the equal of the Lord. They asked the explosive question, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? They told the peasants that their servitude was a man-made injustice, not a divine command.
The whispers of change, of defiance, grew louder. The peasants began to organize, to meet in secret in the woods and the fields, to swear oaths of solidarity. All they needed was a spark to ignite the dry tinder of their anger. In England, in 1381, that spark came in the form of a tax collector, who arrived in a village in Essex and tried to collect the hated poll tax. He was met not with submission, but with violence. He was driven from the village, and the rebellion began. The news spread like wildfire. Village after village rose up. Great armies of peasants, armed with their farm tools, with pitchforks, with scythes, with axes, and led by charismatic figures like Wat Tyler, began to march on London. They were not a disorganized mob. They were a disciplined and determined force with a clear set of demands: an end to serfdom, the repeal of the labor laws, the punishment of corrupt royal officials, and more just social order. They burned manor houses. They destroyed the hated manorial records that were the written proof of their servitude. They captured the Tower of London. They executed the Archbishop of Canterbury and the King's treasurer. For a few brief, terrifying weeks, it seemed as if the entire social order of England was on the verge of collapse. In the end, the revolt was brutally crushed. The young king, Richard II, met with the rebels, made false promises, and then had their leaders captured and executed. The peasant armies were scattered, but the memory of the revolt would linger for centuries. It was a terrifying reminder to the ruling classes that the obedience of the poor could not be taken for granted. It was a powerful and bloody demonstration that the quiet, submissive, and seemingly powerless peasants, when pushed too far, had the capacity to rise up and to shake the very foundations of their world. The whispers of change had become a shout, and it was a shout that would never be entirely silenced again.
The Silent Wars of Succession. The most visible wars of the Dark Ages are the ones fought on the battlefield, with the clash of swords and the thunder of cavalry. But there is another kind of war, a war that is fought not in the open field, but in the quiet, candlelit chambers of the royal court. It is the silent, secret, and often deadly war of succession. In an age of hereditary monarchy, the question of who will inherit the crown when the king dies is the most important and the most dangerous political question of all. The ideal is a simple and orderly succession. The king lives a long life, he has a healthy and legitimate son, and when the king dies, the son seamlessly ascends to the throne. But reality is rarely so neat. The king might die young, leaving a child as his heir, a situation that invites the powerful nobles of the realm to fight amongst themselves for control of the regency. The king might have no sons, only a daughter, and the question of whether a woman can rule is a deeply contentious one. Or, most dangerously of all, the king might die with no clear or undisputed heir, leaving a power vacuum that multiple claimants, all with some distant, plausible connection to the royal bloodline, will rush to fill. When the king is old and ailing, or when the succession is uncertain, the royal court is transformed into a nest of intrigue. It is a place of profound and suffocating anxiety, where every word, every glance, every gesture is a political calculation. The great nobles of the realm begin to choose sides, to form factions around the potential claimants to the throne. The war is fought with whispers. A secret meeting is held in a dark corner of the chapel. A rumor is started, a lie designed to discredit a rival claimant, perhaps a suggestion that he is illegitimate or that he is a secret heretic. A nobleman who was once a trusted advisor to the king might suddenly find himself out of favor, his access to the royal presence denied because a rival has whispered a word of poison in the king's ear. The war is fought with alliances, often sealed by marriage. A powerful duke will marry his daughter to one claimant, bringing his own wealth and his private army of knights to the cause. Another will align himself with a different claimant, and the great families of the kingdom begin to divide into armed camps.
And sometimes the war is fought with poison. A claimant to the throne, a man who seemed strong and healthy, might suddenly be struck down by a violent, mysterious sickness. His death is officially attributed to a fever or to a surfeit of rich food, but the whispers will say otherwise. They will speak of a poisoned cup of wine, of a trusted servant who was bribed to do the deed. In the paranoid, high-stakes world of the court, it is impossible to know who to trust. Your closest friend could be your deadliest enemy. The court becomes a place of fear. The courtiers watch the king's health with a morbid, obsessive intensity. They watch each other, trying to discern the shifting patterns of allegiance. They know that to back the wrong horse in the race for the throne is to risk everything. When the new king finally comes to power, he will reward his supporters with land, with titles, with wealth, and he will ruthlessly punish his enemies. To choose the losing side is to face the confiscation of your lands, exile, or the executioner's block. This silent, secret war can simmer for years, a cancer growing in the heart of the kingdom. And when the old king finally dies, it often erupts into open, bloody, and devastating civil war. The plots and the whispers of the candlelit chambers give way to the grim reality of the battlefield. The silent war of succession is a testament to the profound fragility of a political system that rests entirely on the life and the bloodline of a single individual.
Fields and farming seasons. The popular image of the Dark Ages is often one of unceasing conflict and chaos. But for the vast majority of people, the defining rhythm of life was not the rhythm of war, but the much slower, older, and more profound rhythm of the agricultural year. The lives of the peasants were governed not by the commands of kings, but by the subtle, irresistible commands of the sun, the soil, and the seasons. To understand their world is to understand the great cyclical drama of sowing, of growing, and of reaping. Winter is the season of slumber. The land is cold and hard, often covered with a blanket of snow or locked in the grip of a deep frost. The work in the fields comes to a halt. It is a time for turning inwards. The peasant family huddles in their smoky hut, their world shrunk to the circle of warmth around the hearth. It is a time of mending tools, for spinning wool, for telling stories. It is a time of scarcity and of hunger, the hungry gap when the previous year's stores are dwindling. But it is also a time of rest, a fallow period for both the land and the people, a time of waiting for the world to be reborn.
Spring is the season of awakening. The first signs are subtle, the slow melting of the snow, the first green shoots pushing their way up through the muddy, thawing earth, the return of the migratory birds. A new energy fills the village. This is the time for the most arduous work of the year, the plowing. The heavy ox-drawn plow is brought out, and the men guide it through the wet, heavy soil, cutting the deep furrows that will be the cradle for the new crop. It is a slow, exhausting, and often frustrating struggle against the stubborn, resistant earth. Then comes the sowing. The precious seed corn, which has been carefully saved from the last harvest, is cast upon the prepared ground. It is an act of profound hope, a gamble on the future, an investment of the present for the sake of the months to come. Summer is the season of growth. The sun climbs higher in the sky, the days grow long and warm. The fields are transformed into a sea of vibrant green. But it is not a time of leisure. It is a time of constant, watchful labor. The crops must be weeded, a back-breaking task performed with a simple hoe. The hay must be mown in the water meadows, a vital source of winter fodder for the livestock.
The peasant watches the sky with a constant, anxious eye, praying for the right balance of sun and rain. A summer drought can wither the crops. A summer hailstorm can flatten them. The fate of the entire year hangs in the delicate balance of the weather. Autumn is the season of climax. It is the harvest, the reap month. The grain is ripe, its heads golden and heavy. The entire village mobilizes in a frantic race against time. Every man, woman, and child is in the fields from sunrise to sunset, cutting the grain with sickles, binding it into sheaves, and stacking it in stooks to dry. The work is exhausting, but it is fueled by a sense of urgency and of hope. A successful harvest is a cause for profound communal relief and celebration. Once the grain is safely gathered in the Lord's great barn, the tension of the year is released. The animals are brought in from the high pastures. The fruits of the orchard are gathered. The preparations for the coming winter begin. This great four-act play of the farming year is the true and fundamental story of the Dark Ages. It is a story of a deep, intimate, and often adversarial relationship with the natural world. It is a story of immense hardship, of constant labor, of deep insecurity. But it is also a story of resilience, of hope, and of a profound and enduring connection to the great cyclical rhythms of the earth.
Festivals and feasts. The life of a peasant in the Dark Ages was one of relentless, grinding toil. The days were long, the work was hard, and the rewards were meager. But it was not a life without its moments of joy, of release, of communal celebration. Woven into the fabric of the working year was a rich and vibrant tapestry of festivals and feasts, holy days that provided a necessary and welcome respite from the hardship of daily existence. These festivals were the bright, colorful threads in a world of earthy browns and grays. The calendar that governed these celebrations was the calendar of the Church. The Christian year was a great cyclical drama, and its major feasts were the most important holidays of the year. The two great pillars of this calendar were Christmas and Easter. The Christmas season, or Yuletide, was a 12-day festival that took place in the very darkest and coldest part of the year. It was a defiant celebration of light and life in the face of the winter gloom. The lord of the manor would often hold a great feast in his hall, and his tenants would be invited. For a peasant, this was a rare and treasured occasion. They would be able to step out of their smoky huts and into the relative warmth and grandeur of the Lord's hall. They would be given food that they would never normally be able to afford: fresh meat, fine white bread, strong ale. There would be music, there would be dancing, there would be the performance of mummers' plays. It was a time when the rigid social hierarchies were briefly softened, a time of shared, communal celebration. Easter was the most important religious festival of the year, a celebration of Christ's resurrection and the promise of eternal life. It was also a celebration of the coming of spring, of the rebirth of the land after the long, dead winter. It was a time of feasting, of games, and of a profound sense of hope and renewal. But the year was also punctuated by a host of other smaller holy days, often dedicated to particular saints. There was Candlemas in February, a festival of light. There was May Day, a deeply pagan festival of fertility that was given a Christian veneer, with its maypoles, its flowers, and its celebrations of the greening of the earth. There was Midsummer's Eve, another night of ancient pagan traditions, with its great bonfires lit on the hills to ward off evil spirits and to celebrate the power of the sun. There was Lammas, or Loaf Mass, in August, a celebration of the beginning of the grain harvest.
These festivals were not just religious observances. They were vital social and economic events. They were the only real holidays that people had.
On a saint's day, all work would cease. The village would gather at the church for a special mass, and then the rest of the day would be given over to feasting, to drinking, to games like wrestling and archery, and to dancing on the village green to the sound of a simple pipe and tabor. These festivals were a crucial release valve, a way of letting off steam and of forgetting, for a brief time, the hardships of life. They were a powerful force for social cohesion, a time when the entire community would come together to reaffirm its shared identity, its shared faith, and its shared hope for a better future. They were the moments when a life of constant labor was briefly transformed into a life of pure, unadulterated, and deeply necessary joy.
Music in the Dark Ages. In our modern world, we are saturated with music. It pours from our devices, it fills our public spaces, it is the constant and often unnoticed soundtrack to our lives. In the Dark Ages, music was a rare and precious thing. In a world that was often brutally harsh and visually drab, the experience of hearing music was a powerful, almost magical event. It was a source of spiritual uplift, of communal joy, and of a deep and profound human connection. The most powerful and pervasive music of the age was the music of the church. To step into a great monastery or a cathedral was to be enveloped in a soundscape that was designed to be otherworldly. The primary form of this music was the Gregorian chant. It was a pure, unaccompanied, monophonic melody sung in Latin by the choir of monks or priests. The sound would rise and fall in long, flowing, and seemingly effortless lines, its melodies weaving themselves into the very architecture of the building. The stone vaults and the high ceilings would catch the sound, amplify it, and make it resonate, creating a sense of a sound that was not coming from human throats, but from the heavens themselves. The purpose of this music was not to entertain, but to elevate the soul, to create a sonic space that was calm, ordered, and entirely focused on the worship of God.
But there was also a vibrant and diverse world of secular music, the music of the court and of the common people. In the great hall of a lord's castle, the music was provided by the minstrel or the troubadour. These were often traveling professional musicians who would move from court to court, their skills a valuable and sought-after commodity. They would accompany themselves on instruments like the lute, a pear-shaped stringed instrument with a delicate, intimate sound, the harp with its clear bell-like tones, or the viol, a bowed, violin-like instrument. They would sing the great epic poems, the chansons de geste, which told of the heroic deeds of Charlemagne and Roland. They would sing the songs of courtly love, tales of knights who performed great deeds for the love of a beautiful and unattainable lady. This music was a sophisticated and highly stylized art form, a key part of the culture of chivalry. In the village, the music was simpler, earthier, and more functional. It was the music of the people. There were the work songs, the rhythmic chants that helped to coordinate the labor of a group of men hauling a heavy log or scything a field of hay. There were the ballads, the long narrative songs passed down orally from one generation to the next that told the local stories, the tales of outlaws, of lovers, of historical events.
And there was the dance music. On a festival day, the village would gather on the green, and a local musician would provide the rhythm for the dancing. The instruments were simple: the pipe and tabor, a small three-holed flute played with one hand while the other hand beats a small drum. The bagpipes, with their droning rustic sound. The hurdy-gurdy, a strange and wonderful instrument where a wheel is turned against the strings to create a continuous, organ-like drone. The music was simple, repetitive, and infectious, a driving force for the joyful, energetic, and often chaotic circle dances of the village. Music in the Dark Ages was not a passive experience.
experience. It was something you participated in. It was a vital and living part of the culture. It was a way of praying, of telling stories, of celebrating, of working, of simply being human. In a world that was often filled with the harsh sounds of struggle and of silence, the soft sound of a lute or the joyful skirl of a pipe was a precious and powerful reminder of the human capacity for beauty, for harmony, and for joy.
Children of the village. Childhood in the Dark Ages was not the sheltered, protected, and prolonged period of innocence that we think of today. It was a short, precarious, and intensely practical apprenticeship for a hard and demanding adult life. For a child born into a peasant family, the world was a place of mud, of animals, of constant labor, and of a freedom that was both exhilarating and fraught with danger. The first and greatest challenge for a child was simply to survive. The rates of infant and child mortality were terrifyingly high. A simple childhood disease like measles or whooping cough, for which we now have vaccines, could be a death sentence. A cut or a scrape could easily become infected and lead to a fatal case of blood poisoning. The water was often unclean, the food was often scarce, and the general lack of sanitation meant that children were in a constant state of war with an invisible army of pathogens. To survive to the age of 10 was a significant achievement.
For those who did survive, life was a mixture of a surprising amount of freedom and an early introduction to the world of work. The village was their playground. There were few formal restrictions on their movements. From a very young age, children would roam in small, semi-feral packs, their faces and clothes caked with the mud that was the ever-present feature of the village landscape. They would play in the streams, they would climb the trees, they would explore the edges of the dark, mysterious woods. Their toys were not manufactured objects, but things they made themselves or found in the natural world. A piece of wood could be a sword. A collection of smooth, round stones could be used for a game of knucklebones. A pig's bladder could be inflated to make a crude and surprisingly bouncy ball. They played games that mimicked the adult world. They played at being knights, at being hunters, at keeping house. But this period of play was short-lived. As soon as a child was old enough to be useful, they were integrated into the economic life of the family. A child of 5 or 6 would be given simple but important chores. They would be sent to gather firewood. They would be tasked with watching the family's geese or chickens to keep them from wandering too far. Their most important job was often that of a living scarecrow. They would spend their entire day in the fields, from sunrise to sunset, armed with a small wooden clapper, their job to shout and to make noise to frighten the birds away from the precious growing crops.
As they grew older, their responsibilities increased. A boy would begin to work alongside his father in the fields, learning how to guide a plow, how to wield a sickle, how to mend a fence. A girl would work beside her mother in the hut, learning the complex and essential skills of spinning, of weaving, of baking, of brewing, of tending to the younger children. There was no formal schooling for a peasant child. Their education was entirely practical, a direct, hands-on apprenticeship in the arts of survival. The relationship between parents and children was different from our own. In a world with such high mortality rates, an emotional overinvestment in a single child was a risky proposition. The relationship was often more practical and less sentimental. But this does not mean it was without love. The love was expressed not in hugs and kisses, but in the practical acts of care, in the sharing of a scarce piece of bread, in the mending of a worn-out tunic, in the passing down of the essential knowledge that would allow the child to survive in their turn.
The children of the village were not coddled, but they were essential. They were the future, the next generation in the long, unbroken, and often difficult chain of human existence.
The quiet wisdom of women. The official history of the Dark Ages is an overwhelmingly male story. It is a story of kings, of popes, of knights, of monks. The voices of women are largely silent, their lives unrecorded, their influence unacknowledged. But to ignore the world of women is to see only half of the picture, for it was the women who were the keepers of the domestic world, the managers of the household economy, and the repositories of a quiet, practical, and absolutely essential form of wisdom. The life of a woman, whether she was the lady of a great manor or the wife of a simple peasant, was defined by her role within the household. The home was her kingdom, and she was its undisputed ruler. This was not a small or insignificant domain. The medieval household was a complex economic unit, a hive of production, and it was the woman who was responsible for its smooth and efficient operation. She was the master of the larder. It was her responsibility to manage the family's food supply, a task of immense and life or death importance. She had to know how to preserve the bounty of the harvest, how to salt the meat from the autumn pig slaughter, how to dry the peas and the beans, how to store the root vegetables in a clamp to protect them from the frost. Her foresight and her skill were what stood between her family and starvation during the long, lean months of the winter.
She was the textile producer. She had to master the entire complex process of turning the raw fleece from the family's sheep into clothing. She had to know how to card the wool, how to spin it into a strong, even thread using a simple drop spindle, and how to weave that thread into a coarse but durable cloth on a simple upright loom. She was the clothier, the one who stitched and mended the garments that protected her family from the cold. She was the brewer and the baker. The two great staples of the medieval diet, bread and ale, were her domain. She had to know the secrets of the sourdough starter, how to grind the grain, how to knead the dough, how to judge the heat of the oven. She had to know the delicate art of brewing, of malking the barley, of managing the fermentation, to produce the safe, nourishing, small beer that was the family's primary drink. And she was the healer. In a world without doctors, it was the woman of the house who was the primary medical practitioner. She was the keeper of the herbal knowledge, a wisdom passed down from her own mother. She knew which plants could be used to make a poultice to soothe a cough, which could be used to make a salve to heal a wound, which could be used to ease the pain of childbirth. She was the midwife, the nurse, the pharmacist. Her garden was her medicine chest. For the lady of a great manor, these responsibilities were magnified 100-fold. She was not just managing a single household. She was the chatelaine, the manager of a vast and complex enterprise. She had to oversee the entire domestic staff, the cooks, the brewers, the weavers, the laundrywomen. She had to manage the vast stores of food and wine. When her husband, the lord, was away at war or at court, which was often for long periods, it was she who was in charge of the entire manor, including its defense. She was a powerful and respected figure, a CEO in a world that had no name for such a thing. The wisdom of these women was not the wisdom of the books in the monastery. It was a quiet, practical, and deeply essential wisdom, a knowledge of the intimate daily arts of survival. Their power was not the public political power of men. It was the quiet domestic power of the hearth, the larder, and the healing herb. It was a power that was often invisible to the official chroniclers, but it was the power that held the medieval world together.
The first universities. As the Dark Ages began to wane and the High Middle Ages began, a new and revolutionary institution started to appear in the intellectual landscape of Europe. It was the university. In cities like Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and Cambridge, communities of scholars and students began to gather, not under the strict devotional rule of a monastery, but in a new kind of organization dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. The birth of the university was one of the first and most powerful signs that a long, slow dawn was beginning to break over the intellectual world of the West. The first universities were not a collection of grand buildings. They were simply guilds or corporations of scholars. They were born out of the cathedral schools, which had long been centers of learning, but they were a new and more independent kind of institution. They were a place where students could come from all over Europe to study at the feet of the great masters of the day, men like Peter Abelard in Paris, whose lectures on logic and theology were electrifying a generation of young minds.
The curriculum of the medieval university was based on the 7 liberal arts, the trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. This was the foundational knowledge that every educated person was expected to possess. But the real intellectual excitement was in the higher faculties of law, of medicine, and most importantly, of theology. The university was the place where the lost knowledge that had been slowly returning to Europe from the Islamic and Byzantine worlds was being studied, debated, and assimilated. The translation of the complete works of Aristotle into Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries was an intellectual event of explosive significance. Aristotle offered a complete, rational, and systematic way of understanding the entire universe based on logic and observation. This new knowledge was both thrilling and deeply challenging to the established faith-based worldview of the Church.
The central intellectual project of the great university scholars, the scholastics, was to reconcile these two powerful systems of thought, the reason of Aristotle and the revelation of the Christian faith. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas created vast, intricate, and breathtakingly ambitious philosophical systems, great cathedrals of the mind, that attempted to show that faith and reason were not in conflict, but were two different and ultimately harmonious paths to the same divine truth. The method of learning in the university was based on debate and disputation. A master would propose a question: does God exist? And the students would be required to argue both sides of the issue, using the rigorous tools of formal logic, citing the authority of the scriptures, of the Church Fathers, and of Aristotle. It was a system that trained the mind to be sharp, critical, and analytical. The life of a student was a hard and often boisterous one. They were typically young men living in rented rooms in the town, often in great poverty. The town and gown relationship between the students and the local townspeople was frequently a hostile one, with frequent brawls and riots. But they were part of a new and exciting international community, a republic of letters that transcended the boundaries of kingdom and of language. The university was a sign that the monopoly on learning, which had been held for centuries by the monasteries, was now being broken. It was the birth of a new kind of intellectual culture, one that was more urban, more argumentative, more secular, and more open to the new currents of thought that were flowing into Europe. It was the place where the young minds of Europe were beginning to stretch, to question, and to build the intellectual foundations for the new world that was to come.
Trade routes and hidden riches. While the intellectual life of Europe was being re-energized by the universities, its economic life was being quietly transformed by another powerful force: the slow but steady reopening of the great long-distance trade routes. The Dark Ages had been a period of economic localization.
But as the chaos of the early medieval period began to subside, the merchants, the sailors, and the bankers of Europe began once again to look beyond their own horizons. This reawakening of trade brought a new and intoxicating flow of goods, of wealth, and of ideas into a world that had been, for centuries, relatively poor and insular. The two great centers of this commercial revolution were in the south and the north. In the south, the Italian city-states of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa rose to dominate the trade of the Mediterranean. Their great merchant fleets, protected by their powerful navies, re-established the ancient trade links with the wealthy and sophisticated worlds of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates. From the ports of Constantinople, of Alexandria, of Acre, the Italian merchants brought back the treasures of the East.
Imagine the wharves of Venice in the 13th century. It is a scene of incredible color, of noise, of exotic smells. A great galley has just arrived from the Levant. Its hold is a treasure chest of goods that are almost magical to the people of the West. There are chests filled with spices, with pepper, with cloves, with cinnamon, with nutmeg. Spices that are worth their weight in gold, that can transform the bland, monotonous diet of the European winter. There are bales of silk from China, a fabric of almost supernatural lightness and sheen. There are fine carpets from Persia with their intricate, vibrant patterns. There are drugs, there are dyes, there are precious stones. In the north, another great trading network emerged, the Hanseatic League, a powerful alliance of merchant cities centered on the Baltic and the North Seas. From cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bruges, the Hanseatic merchants controlled the trade in the essential bulk commodities of the north. They brought timber and furs from Russia, dried fish from Norway, wool from England, wine from France.
This explosion of trade created a new and powerful class of people: the merchants, the bankers, the urban bourgeoisie. They were a new kind of elite, their power based not on the ownership of land, like the feudal nobility, but on the control of capital, of money. They built great houses in the towns. They financed the wars of kings. They became the patrons of a new kind of urban art. The trade routes were conduits not just for goods, but for knowledge and for technology. From the east came the magnetic compass, which made long-distance sea travel safer and more predictable. From China came the secrets of paper-making, which would make the production of books cheaper and more widespread. From the Islamic world came the system of Arabic numerals, with its revolutionary concept of the zero, which made complex commercial calculations possible. This reawakening of trade was a slow and often dangerous process. The seas were plagued by pirates, the roads were infested with bandits. But the potential for profit was so great that the merchants persevered. They were the quiet, unsung heroes of the late Dark Ages. They were the weavers who began to stitch the isolated, fragmented world of Europe back together, and back into the larger, richer, and more complex tapestry of the global economy. They were the ones who brought the hidden riches and the transformative ideas of the outside world slipping quietly into the heart of Christendom.
The spark of art. In the midst of the gloom, the hardship, and the austerity that so often characterized the Dark Ages, there were moments of breathtaking and transcendent beauty. The artistic impulse of humanity was not extinguished. It was simply channeled into new and powerful forms of expression. The art of the Dark Ages was not the realistic, human-centered art of the classical world, nor was it the dramatic, perspective-driven art of the Renaissance to come. It was an art that was primarily symbolic, decorative, and deeply spiritual. An art that sought not to replicate the world, but to give a glimpse of the divine, otherworldly glory of God. The greatest artistic achievements of the early medieval period were often small, intricate, and portable. In the workshops of the Anglo-Saxon and the Celtic peoples, the metalworkers, the jewelers were masters of their craft. The treasures discovered in the Sutton Hoo ship burial, for example, are a testament to their incredible skill. They created objects of breathtaking complexity and beauty. Great golden belt buckles, covered in a swirling, abstract pattern of interwoven, stylized animals. Sword hilts, inlaid with intricate patterns of cloisonné garnet. Purses and shoulder clasps of gold and enamel. This was an art of pure, dynamic, and almost electric pattern. An art that was designed to glitter and to impress in the dim, flickering firelight of a lord's great hall.
In the monasteries of Ireland and of Northumbria, this same love of intricate pattern was translated onto the pages of the illuminated manuscripts. In masterpieces like the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels, the monks created an art form of almost hallucinatory complexity. They would take the first letter of a gospel and expand it to fill an entire page, transforming it into a labyrinth of interwoven spirals of stylized birds and beasts, their bodies elongated and contorted to fit the intricate design. These carpet pages were not just decoration, they were objects of intense, meditative contemplation, visual puzzles that were designed to draw the viewer's mind away from the mundane world and into a higher, more spiritual realm. As the Dark Ages progressed and a new sense of stability and prosperity began to emerge, the artistic impulse found a new and monumental form of expression, the great Romanesque and Gothic cathedrals. These were the largest and most ambitious building projects of the age, great Bibles in stone that were designed to be overwhelming, awe-inspiring expressions of the power and the glory of God.
And it was in these cathedrals that a new and revolutionary art form was born, the stained glass window. For the first time, artists were able to paint with light itself. They would cut pieces of colored glass, deep luminous blues, rich ruby reds, vibrant greens, and join them together with strips of lead to create huge narrative windows that depicted the stories of the Bible and the lives of the saints. When the sun shone through these windows, it would project a kaleidoscope of vibrant jewel-like color onto the cool gray stone of the interior. For the ordinary, illiterate person, to stand in this space and to be bathed in this colored, holy light was to be given a direct, emotional, and unforgettable glimpse of the beauty and the mystery of heaven. The art of the Dark Ages was not an art of darkness. It was an art that was obsessed with light. It was the glitter of gold in the firelight, the luminous colors of an illuminated manuscript, the divine colored light of a stained glass window. It was a spark, a defiant and beautiful spark of human creativity, burning brightly in the long and often somber twilight of the medieval world.
The end of the dark. There is no single moment, no great battle or the signing of a treaty that marks the end of the Dark Ages. The transition to the new world of the Renaissance was not a sudden event, but a slow, gradual, and often uneven dawning, a process that had been quietly underway for centuries. The darkness did not vanish overnight in a brilliant flash of light. It simply, slowly began to recede as a new set of ideas, a new way of seeing the world, and a new confidence in the potential of humanity began to take hold. The seeds of this change were sown in the very soil of the late Dark Ages. The rise of the universities had created a new intellectual culture, one that was based on logic, on debate, and on a renewed engagement with the rational philosophy of the ancient world. The reawakening of trade had broken down the old, insular world of feudalism, creating a new, wealthy, and powerful urban class of merchants and bankers, who were more interested in the affairs of this world
then in the promises of the next. The Black Death, in its horrifying devastation, had shattered the old social and religious certainties, leaving behind a world that was more fluid, more individualistic, and more open to new ideas. The heart of this transformation was in Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries. It was here that the new wealth from the Mediterranean trade was most concentrated. It was here that the physical remains of the Roman Empire were a constant, visible reminder of a lost age of glory. And it was here that a new intellectual movement, known as humanism, began to emerge.
Lost manuscripts of Cicero in dusty monastic libraries. They believed that the ancient world represented a peak of human achievement, and that the best way to create a new and better world was to study and to imitate the classics. This led to a profound shift in focus. The medieval worldview had been profoundly God-centered. The purpose of life was to prepare the soul for the afterlife. The humanist worldview, while still deeply Christian, was more human-centered. It celebrated the dignity, the potential, and the creative power of the individual. It argued that to live a full and virtuous life in this world was also a form of service to God. This new way of thinking had a revolutionary impact on the arts. Artists were no longer content to create the flat, symbolic, and otherworldly images of the medieval style. They began to study the realistic sculptures of ancient Rome. They began to study human anatomy. They developed the mathematical principles of linear perspective, which allowed them to create the illusion of three-dimensional space on a flat surface. Artists like Giotto and later Brunelleschi, Donatello, and Masaccio began to paint a world that was realistic, that was rational, and that was populated by human beings who were not just symbols, but solid, emotional, and individual figures.
It was a new age of exploration, of scientific discovery, of artistic genius. But it was not a complete rejection of the world that had come before it. It was a world that was built upon the foundations that had been slowly and painfully laid throughout the long centuries of the Dark Ages. The universities, the trade routes, the preservation of the classical texts, the very languages and the nations of Europe, all of these were the legacy of the medieval world. The darkness had not been a void. It had been a long, slow, and often difficult gestation. And now, the new world was finally ready to be born.
As our slow, quiet walk through the shadows of the past comes to an end, and as you prepare to drift into the deeper shadows of your own sleep, it is worth pausing for a moment to ask what these long-lost centuries can teach us in the quiet hours of our own modern night. It is easy to look back on the Dark Ages with a sense of distance, to see it as a world of hardship and superstition that is thankfully far removed from our own. But if we listen closely, if we adjust our eyes to the flickering candlelight, we can find in this distant past a set of deep and enduring truths about the human condition. The first and most powerful lesson is one of resilience. The people of the Dark Ages lived in a world of profound and constant insecurity. They faced the threats of famine, of plague, of war, of a natural world that they did not understand and could not control. Their lives were, by our standards, incredibly hard, and yet they endured. They built communities, they raised families, they created works of breathtaking beauty. They found ways to live and to find meaning in the face of immense hardship. Their story is a powerful testament to the stubborn, quiet, and almost indestructible nature of the human spirit.
It is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is a deep, instinctive human drive to survive, to create, and to hope.
Need for meaning. In a world that was often chaotic and seemingly random, the Christian faith provided a powerful and comprehensive framework for making sense of existence. It offered an explanation for suffering, a promise of justice in the next life, and a set of rituals that gave structure and meaning to the great universal experiences of birth, of marriage, and of death. While we may no longer share their specific theological beliefs, their world reminds us of the fundamental human need to believe in something larger than ourselves, to find a narrative that can give our own small, brief lives a sense of purpose and of significance. The third lesson is one of humility. The Dark Ages remind us that our own age, with all its technological marvels and its scientific certainties, is not the final chapter in the human story. The people of the Middle Ages believed that their world, with its divinely ordained hierarchy of king, lord, and peasant, was a permanent and unchangeable reality. They could not have imagined the world that was to come. In the same way, we cannot truly imagine the world that will follow our own. The story of the Dark Ages teaches us that history is a long and unpredictable river, and that our own moment is just a small, fleeting part of its much larger journey. It encourages us to look at our own certainties with a degree of skepticism, and to remember that the dark ages of the future may well be our own.
Of this distant and misunderstood time be a source of quiet contemplation. Let it be a reminder of the enduring strength of the human spirit, of the power of faith to sustain us in times of trial, and of the simple, profound, and timeless truth that even after the longest, the coldest, and the darkest of nights, the dawn will eventually and always come again.